80 years ago, on the Gothic Line in the northeast Apennine Mountains overlooking the Adriatic Sea, more than 50,000 Indian soldiers fighting as part of the British Eighth Army played a pivotal role in helping to defeat Nazi and Italian fascist tyranny in Italy. The story of the Indian troop bravery and heroism in the brutal battle to restore democracy in Italy and Europe, and this also includes Gurkha soldiers from Nepal, is one that is given short shrift in many history books, despite the fact that they were the third largest army to fight on the Gothic Line behind the British and American troops. Just as obscure is the fact that Scottish Highlander troops were embedded in some of the three Indian divisions that were commanded by British high ranking officers. The story of how teamwork and camaraderie shared among the Indian, Gurkha, and Scottish troops and the success they achieved is one that is a vital European history lesson and particularly poignant in today's world where immigrants, especially those of color, are often seen as scourges of society. Today is the first of a two-part Indian Division series where I will try to unpack and explain just who these soldiers were and where they fought on the Gothic Line. To help me do that, I have three experts in the studio who have not only spent years combing the Gothic Line battlefields in the Tuscany and Romagna regions, but also have spent untold hours researching archives to put all of the pieces of this often puzzling story together. Arguably, nobody has built up more knowledge about the Indian and Gurkha soldiers fighting in the Allied campaign in Italy than Daniel Cesaretti. Daniel has, for the past 40 years, not only researched the Indian soldier story, but also has led efforts to commemorate them, including the launching of a museum, as well as memorials at sites throughout Italy. He has also authored several books on the subject. Daniel, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you for having me.
Along with Daniel, I'm privileged to have here today Dhruv Ratti, who is an Indian expatriate who has been living and working for the past 15 years in Italy as an engineer for an Italian multinational company. Those who have listened to previous podcast episodes might remember Dhruv as he detailed earlier this year his work trying to rectify grievous and sometimes sacrilegious errors where Indian and Gurkha soldiers are buried or were cremated in different British Commonwealth grave sites on the Gothic Line. In addition, he has worked to raise awareness of the Indian story in his home country, where it essentially has been erased since the country gained independence in 1947 and was divided with the birth of Pakistan and later in 1971, the formation of Bangladesh. Today, Dhruv will explain the makeup and the role of the 10th Indian Division. Dhruv, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for inviting me again.
Last but by no means least, I have Matteo Mascia with me today, who, despite his young age of 27, is one of the most passionate and knowledgeable historians of the role of the Scottish Highlander Argyll and Sunderland troops and their cooperation with the Indian 8th Division on the Gothic Line. Matteo is also the vice director of a Gothic Line museum located in the Italian city of Faenza near the Adriatic coast, and where there is also a Commonwealth War cemetery. In addition, Matteo is the director of the Argyll Romagna Group, which enhances much needed awareness within Italian society of the Gothic Line story by conducting battlefield tours and reenactments. Matteo, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Joe. Hello, everyone.
So, Daniel, I would like to start with you. And as I mentioned, you are considered the premier expert on the overall Indian division and Gurkha soldier story. So before we get to the Gothic Line, it's important, of course, for listeners to understand that the Indian and Gurkha troops arrived in Italy in 1943 and had been fighting for almost a year before the start of the Gothic Line offensive. So can you give us a brief rundown of the Indian troop history with the British Army, what their role was during the first year of the Allied campaign in Italy, and how it influenced the British command in determining the Gothic Line battlefield plans for the three Indian divisions and the Gurkhas?
All right, so let's start mentioning the North African campaign and East African campaign in which the Indian divisions played a pivotal role. The Axis forces actually surrendered to the 4th Indian Division. That's the commander-in-chief, Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, surrendered to the 4th Indian Division. After this, in late 1943, from November and December on, the Indian divisions were shifted to the Italian campaign, starting from the Adriatic coast and just shortly north of Taranto, the heel of Italy. And they first sought action along a string of rivers, the Trigno, Biferno, Sangro, and Moro. They were siding the Canadian Corps in the sector, and they played a paramount role in reaching the first winter line. That was along the Gustav Line in the area roughly of Ortona, which was dubbed later as the Stalingrad of Italy, in which the Canadian forces fought, while the Indians were to the left or to the west, if you like, of the Canadians. From there on, these units were shifted to the Casino front. And then actually in February 1944, the 4th Indian Division led an attack on Monte Cassino. In all truth, it was effective. And in fact, some Rajput units, troops, reached the monastery. Lacking communications and reinforcements, they were forced to withdraw. And there was a second attack led 1 month later by chiefly the 9th Gurkhas, who fought their way nearly above the midway to Monte Cassino, reaching this place called Hangsman Hill, where they were ambushed and they were encircled and isolated from the rest of the Allied units for a good week. So they had been, let's say, virtually lost just below so-called Hangman's Hill. But they were subsequently relieved and recovered. Then the 8th Indian Division played a paramount role in crossing the Gari River during the outbreak from the Casino front. And that's where one Indian, Kamal Ran, was awarded the Victoria Cross. And then from there on commenced the advance towards central and northern Italy. And that was the phase of approach towards the Gothic Line. They were advancing along the Tiber River and following by the Arno River. Eventually, we'll get back to this later.
So can you give us some insight about why each of the Indian divisions had a battalion of Scottish or English troops embedded in the division?
As well as some Welsh units, too. This is a long story that dates back to 1857, when there had been a revolt in India against the British troops who were leading the British Indian Army. There had been the so-called mutiny of the sepoys, and there was one of the primitive initial rebellions against the British occupation of the Raj of India. Most interesting, this rebellion had been broken up by the support of the Gurkhas, who, instead of siding with the Indians, with the ethnic Indians, they sided with the Brits. And this is the occasion, the first chance that the Gurkhas had in proving their loyalty to the British crown. That's why they gained this fame, and in following decades, they maintained this reputation of loyalty for the British crown. I understand that today this is politically disputable, but that's the way history goes. So, in order to prevent further rebellions, in each and every Indian division, there were 2 or 3 British regiments, either Scottish, English, or Welsh.
So in Italy, were the Indian troops volunteers or were they conscripts?
All the Indian troops were volunteers throughout the entire World War, especially those who fought in Burma and in India itself. They were all volunteers. This is a rather interesting issue because they volunteered to support the Western democracies. Although they were colonial troops, they had chosen the lesser evil rather than to ally with the Axis, the Japanese, the Italians, and the Nazis, with the pretext that once the war was over, India could gain independence. And this is a very important issue because the Indians threw in something like 2.5 million volunteers. This really changed the tide of the war. Their role was paramount in the Middle East, in controlling the Persian corridor through which the Soviet Union could be supplied of most needed weaponry from the Lend-Lease Act, and fight the Nazis in the most critical moment when the Nazis and the Germans were in the outskirts of Moscow. So we owe a great debt of gratitude to the Indians, who also blocked the Japanese advance on the borders of India, where the greatest battle ever fought in World War II was at Imphal and Kohima. So they blocked the Japanese advance, or else there was the risk of connecting the Germans and the Japanese. So that's why we owe a great debt of gratitude to all Indian troops, 2.5 million, and roughly 10 million civilians who were committed in the industrial facilities and weaponry and so on, miners and so on.
So, a mistake that some novices make is to call the three Indian divisions mountain troops because their assigned role was in the Apennine Mountains on the Gothic Line, ranging from Tuscany in central Italy to the mountaintop towns that overlook the coastal plain in the Adriatic Sea. And I know I've been guilty of that myself. But among the Indian contingent, there was, as I mentioned, and you mentioned, the Gurkha troops, and they were definitely trained as mountain fighters as they were born and raised in the Himalaya kingdom of Nepal. So I would like to start with the Gurkhas because they were the first troops to launch the Gothic Line offensive in late August of 1944. And this attack was the first of an overall 1-2 punch Allied army plan to break through the Gothic Line, German mountaintop fortifications, and by Christmas, surround and liberate Bologna, where the Nazis were headquartered. And Daniel, as you have described in your books and other publications, the Gurkha mountain fighting skills were crucial in successfully liberating the mountaintop town of Tavoleto, which was the first days of the Gothic Line offensive. So can you tell me more about the story of the liberation of Tavoleto and why was it chosen to launch the entire Gothic Line offensive?
Well, Tavoleto was one of the main German strongholds along the initial Gothic line, which is actually a belt. So there was the first line of the Gothic line that was overlooking the river Folia. There were several strongholds here. One was in the Canadian sector, and this was Tavullia. And shortly to the west, there was Germano, and then there was Tavoleto a bit in the upper valley of the Folia. These were all hilltops, and they were well fortified by the Germans, preparing this line that was stretching all the way to the other side of Italy on the Mediterranean Sea. And the 4th Indian Division was one of the strongest in the Allied hands. There's a long story behind this, but it was one of the most reliable units, and it was thrown against the German stronghold of Tavoleto. The first conquer of this objective was the Monte Calva feature. This was taken by the Sikhs and the Baluchis. But overlooking this first hilltop was a second, Tavoleto, in which the 4th Division launched the Cameron Highlanders as a decoy, the 9th Gurkha as another decoy, while the 7th Gurkhas made a flanking maneuver up through the ravines and the creeks, so sneaking in, infiltrating the German lines. And while the Germans were looking at the Cameron sector and the 9th Gurkhas, during a nighttime maneuver, the 7th Gurkhas assaulted Tavoleto, and there had been hand-to-hand fighting, street-to-street fighting in the style of Stalingrad for a few hours, but they managed to conquer and knock out this German stronghold, although it was a very bloody battle.
So following the conquest of Tavoleto, the 4th Indian Division engaged with the Germans in the mountaintop town of Germano, which you just mentioned was also one of the Nazi strongholds. And
Yeah.
this confrontation is often referred to as the little casino of the Adriatic because it was such a ferocious battle that completely destroyed the picturesque village, and many soldiers suffered loss of life. So, can you tell us a little bit more about the significance of the Germano confrontation?
The Germano feature was a very high peak overlooking the coastal roads. And the Brits had launched three divisions against it: the 56th, the 46th, and the third was actually a brigade, the 2nd Armored Brigade. The battle for conquering Germano went on for a good 10 days. But fortunately, the 4th Indian Division was available to reach the Germano feature and break the stalemate. This was a very bloody battle. The Germans had real mountain troops, the Gebirge of Austrian origin, and the Germans lost 900 men there, killed in action, plus all the other wounded and missing in action. And the Brits had losses by the hundreds, but thank God there was the 4th Indian Division to bring a relief and have the Germans retreat to the following secondary Gothic line, which was along the Rimini and Coriano Ridge line.
Okay, so now I'd like to turn to you, Dhruv. So before I ask you about the 10th Indian Division in the British 8th Army, I want to ask you about the many Indian ethnic and religious groups that were fighting in Italy. And history tells us that there were major differences and tension, for example, between the Hindus and Muslims when India won independence 2 years after World War II concluded. In fact, violence between the two religious groups led to the division of India with the creation of Pakistan and subsequently Bangladesh. So, did any of these tensions surface in the heat of battle in Italy and on the Gothic Line?
Well, Joe, the bonding between the Indian troops was very strong. Even though they will not break bread together, but in the battlefield, they fought for each other. They looked after each other. What I want to mention is the bonding in Indian Army, which has existed for almost like 200 years now, the oldest regiments going back 200 years. It is based on the person who is next to me, who has fought with me in the battlefield, is my brother. Okay. And when a new officer he joins the army, he's often asked a question, what is your religion? And if he'll say Hindu or Sikh, he'll say wrong answer. The right answer is that my religion is the religion of my soldiers. If my soldiers are Hindus, I am Hindu. If my soldiers are Sikh, I'm Sikh. If my soldiers are Muslims, I'm Muslim. That is the type of bonding which Indian Army always had. And I can confirm to you that there were no tensions except for, okay, maybe who's going to get the first Victoria Cross for the division. Maybe that could have been like tension between troops and who could perform better in the field. That sort of tension could have been there, but nothing on communal lines. Okay, I would like to also discuss about the composition of the Indian troops. So, to give you an example, it was a complete rainbow. There were troops from all across India. Most of the troops which were in the infantry units, they were from northern India. So, we had Sikhs, we had Dogras, we had Muslimans, we had Pathans, we had Jats, we had Gurkhas, we had Garhwalis, we had Rajputs. All these are from northern India. And we also had units from central India, namely Marathas. They are from central and central West India. Whereas the support units, they were from southernmost part of India. There were engineers from Madras. And if you go to Ortona sector, there's a bridge on SS-16, which still bears the emblem of Madras engineers.
So, Dhruv, concerning the 10th Indian Division specifically, can you tell us where they were deployed with the start of the Gothic Line offensive?
The Indian troops, where was the 10th Indian Division? it was the last to arrive in Italy. It arrived in March of 1944, and it was under the leadership of Major General Dennis Reed. And Major General Dennis Reed, he actually escaped from captivity in Italy in November of 1943. And in January, he took command of the 10th Indian Division. The 10th Indian Division reached Taranto, and immediately they were sent to relieve the Canadians in Orsonia and Ortona sector. After this, 10th Indian Division, uh, during the months of August, they were based uh, north of Arezzo and Subiano. So that's where they were before the assault on the Gothic Line.
Where were they deployed the first part of the Gothic Line offensive?
So in the first part of the Gothic Line, they were under the 10th Corps north of Arezzo, and they took Monte della Modena and Monte della Verna in late in September of 1944. And they were based in the Arno Valley, and eventually they were sent to relieve the 4th Indian Division on the Adriatic sector in the last week of September and first week of October.
Daniel, just want to get back to you just really quick before we get to Matteo. So fighting alongside the 10th and the 4th Division was the Scottish Highlander troops, who were from the Inverness part of Scotland. So what can you tell us about their role and how they intermingled and worked alongside the Indian soldiers?
Oh, there was a brotherhood between them and the Indians as well. These units were very compact, and moreover, these were seasoned units, both the 4th Indian Division, the 10th, and the 8th. So they were in perfect symphony and harmony. As a matter of fact, I can remind you this battle of the Cameron Highlanders. It's near the place Jouve mentioned of Subiano, the other side of the valley compared to that in which the 10th was deployed. There's the Battle of Poggio del Grillo, which sought very heavy losses by the Cameron Highlanders, and they fought atop of this place for a couple of days, suffering enormous losses. They were relieved by the Gurkhas of the 2nd Regiment, and years ago, along with the fellows of the museum in Subiano, we unveiled a memorial in remembrance of all these units. And in the same area, the Sikhs were deployed just shortly to the side of the Highlanders. So as you see, there was perfect coordination between these troops. There was mutual support in any theater, so there was no tensions or frictions even between the soldiers of two different countries, the Brits and the Indians.
And so when exactly was that?
This was in early August 1944. But I would like to remind you that within these divisions, not only Indian Division, not only were there Cameron Highlanders, there were other British units such as the Sussex, the Essex, who were constantly shift within a division or the other. So it's hard to keep track and record of these units precisely. Especially the formation of the 10th Division changed shortly after the Battle of Cassino. So it's hard to keep records, and each and every battlefield had rearrangements.
Okay. Now I wanted to turn to Matteo. Matteo, we first met earlier this year when you led a tour high in the Apennine Mountains separating Florence and Faenza, and you explained the role of a company of the Scottish Argyll and Sunderland troops. And then a few months later, we met again at a very moving 80th anniversary commemoration ceremony held by the Indian Sikh community at the Indian Soldier Cemetery in Forli. And as I mentioned, the Argyll and Sunderlands were embedded in the Indian 8th Division. They fought side by side and were moving about together in different positions. So, Matteo, tell us about what the Argyll and Sunderland Highlanders were tasked to do at the start of the Gothic Line and why and how they were working together with the Indian Division.
Okay, so let's start by saying that the 1st Argyll and Southern Highlanders Battalion was fighting in Italy since the Sicily disembarking. They were part of the Beach Briggs, on the eastern part of Sicily, helping the other troops to land on the first part of the offensive. Then they moved north to Italy. Another major event was the Cassino battle. They were part of the battle on the Rapido River. They had many casualties. Since this episode, we can already start saying that this battalion was an elite battalion. Most of them were fighting together since the North African campaign, some even before. So most of them were from Stirling, Edinburgh, or Aberdeen. They knew each other before, and then by time and of course due to a lot of casualties and death, they were replaced by other soldiers coming from other parts or even from other countries. So after the campaign was a success on the center of Italy and they moved to Tuscany, they were part of the 8th Army in the advance, joined with the United States Army in Tuscany. They were near Florence, and we are talking about the summer of 1944. Stayed here for quite a bit of time, even resting in some parts. So their task was related to the strategy that the British and American command to pass through the front line of the Gothic Line. The first strategy they tried to use was a direct attack from Firenze and Arezzo toward Bologna, straight on the Apennines. But this was considered useless because of the terrain of how the Apennines became a natural defense for the Germans, and because they already fortified every single position, created bunkers and a similar defense line. So they didn't attack straight on through the Apennines on that period, but they decided to pass on the Adriatic coast. But the Argyll, that were part of the 8th Indian Division and the 1st British Division, together with the British Armoured Division and the 6th South African Division, were not together with the main corps of the British Army because they were deployed under the command of Clark's United States Army in this part of the campaigns. The Argyll, together with the Indian forces, were in near the Muraglione Pass region, Acquacheta, San Godenzo, San Benedetto in Alpe. We're talking about an eastern part of Tuscany, lying between Emilia-Romagna and Tuscany. And they were tasked to help the American forces through these mountain pass to do infantry fighting. And we are in September 1944 and October 1944. Their advance was very difficult because we are already in the end of summer and was starting to become a little bit colder. Their task was from very small, narrow streets or mountain pass, so they didn't even have the specific map. You need to find the old Italian geographic map to compare, to have a reference for this part of the Apennines. And they reached not far from Marradi. Their main task was to take the town and both of the valleys together with the Indian forces. So we can say that mainly they supported the American soldier on the Apennines. And in fact, if you take a look on the battlefield where the Argyll fought together with the Indians, you can find not only British equipment, but also American, because they changed a lot position. And this was a strategy also to make sure that the Germans didn't know exactly where they were and what was the next move in the general strategy. Sometimes the Indian had to fight for conquering one hill and the Argyll the other, as happened in Monte Cavallaro.
So Monte Cavallaro was a key strategic goal for the 8th Division and the Argyll troops. So, and this turned into a brutal, bloody confrontation, as you mentioned, in the freezing rain and the cold. And there's a very interesting book that was published in 1996 by the son of a Scottish Argyll officer, Ray Ward, who survived the battle and the war. And he wrote an unpublished memoir that his son Robin discovered after his father's death in a box in the house of his father. And then Robin Ward, subsequently, he came to Italy in the early 90s, retraced his father's steps and edited his father's story in a book that is titled The Mirror at Monte Cavallaro. Unfortunately, Robin Ward was not able to join us today for this discussion. So, Matteo, can you tell us how important has that book been in helping to understand and plan, for example, the Argyll Romagna group reenactment activities.
Yeah, the book is exceptional and fundamental because we can say that all the Italian campaign have a lot of sources, sometimes from the National Archives or the Imperial War Museum. But if you want to look close to what they did, how they felt, and other aspect of the British campaign in Italy, and specifically each battalion or regiment, you need to have memories. The war diaries sometimes are not enough because they are objective and they are a summary. They are not very specific. So when they reach Monte Cavallara, we are in October, and the first day they have a very terrible battle. Of course, if we look at the War Diary report, this can pass like a normal battle. But if you look at the book, this changed. And Monte Cavallara was one of the, can be example of the fightings on the Gothic Line on the Apennines during the Second World War, because it was on top of a hill. The Germans were very cunning, so they knew that the valleys could be controlled by very few guns, sometimes machine guns and anti-tank guns or self-propelled guns. They could be hidden inside the mountains or uh, pretty much near where the main passage of the valley was, and could stop the advance for many months. On the book, we found how they planned the attack to the mountain, how they felt, which men were rewarded, and who died on that day, and how many casualties, how they were dressed and equipped, how they moved, how the strategy changed during the developing of the fighting. So the book was fundamental.
Okay, thank you, Matteo. It's very interesting. So, Daniel, turning back to you, we know that the Adriatic part of the Gothic Line offensive did not go as planned, actually as well as the Americans' part on the western side. But the weather and the terrain, especially numerous overflowing rivers spilling out of the mountains, had a lot to do with the difficulties. And so, among the various hilltop towns that was a target of the Adriatic offensive was San Marino, which has been a semi independent territory in Italy, similar to, say, Monaco in France or Andorra in Spain. And during World War II, San Marino was another strategic German army stronghold, as it had an expansive view of the coastline and, most important, the port city of Rimini just below it. So, can you tell us a little bit about the conquest of San Marino and what that involved?
Oh yeah, for sure. So you were mentioning the stall of the Gothic Line. It started already on Coriano Ridge, which blocked the advance for a good 2 weeks. After conquering Coriano Ridge, the next main objective of the Allied and British commanders was San Marino, because it had a feature similar to that of the Rock of Gibraltar, and I find analogies even with Monte Cavallaro, as Matteo mentioned. This is sort of a Rock of Gibraltar. You can see as far as the entire coast, and with binoculars, you can also see across the Adriatic Sea and the coast of former Yugoslavia. So the Germans occupied 4 strongholds in San Marino, although it was a neutral state at the time. This because there had been a precedent just 2 or 3 months earlier in which, mistakenly, the South African Air Force bombed San Marino at the time in which the front was south of Ancona and in central Italy. So the Germans had a pretext to get into San Marino and establish 4 strongholds, one of which was the Faetano Knoll. It's just a knoll, a little small hill in which there was a furious battle fought by the Gurkhas. Descending from Coriano, the 4th Indian Division was sent straight up towards San Marino, since this was the most reliable unit for this task. The Baluchis establishing a bridgehead over the Marano Creek, followed by the Gurkhas in the assault of this knoll overlooking Faetano, and there had been a bloody battle for 5 hours, to break up which the Gurkhas called in the support of 400 guns in the British sector, all converging to a nearby hill 393, from which the Germans were developing a counterattack. So you can imagine 400 guns firing all at the same time. There were thousands of rounds to break up this German counteroffensive. The day after, the Germans retreated upwards towards the mountain and established another stronghold in Borgo, just at the foothold of this rocky mountain. The Sikhs from Faetano were launched towards the little town of Borgo, and after them, Cameron Highlanders once again were thrown into action, and they conquered Borgo by street fighting, house-to-house fighting. And during the Battle of San Marino, it's important to note that Gurkha Sherbadur Top of the 9th Gurkhas was awarded posthumously the Victoria Cross, for which I promoted years ago the erection of a memorial in remembrance of the sacrifice of himself and the other Gurkhas in his unit. After the conquer of Borgo by the Camerons, the Germans were forced to withdraw to the next line, which was just across the Marecchia River. And soon after that, there was another bloody battle on Turiana, better known as Corticazza Ridge. And soon after that, the 4th Indian Division was withdrawn from the Italian campaign and sent into Greece for peacekeeping purposes. And that's another long story.
So, Dhruv, coming back to you. So, after the Battle of San Marino, tell us briefly about what the 10th Indian Division's role was as they also were passing through various ridges, basically trying to protect the flank of the British, Canadian, Polish, New Zealand troops that were moving up the coastal plain.
So the 10th Indian Division, they completed the relief of 4th Indian Division by 3rd of October 1944. And after this, immediate preparations were to take San Martino Soliano Ridge. There were the two brigades, the 20th Brigade and the 25th Brigade. They were assigned the task. 20th Brigade was to take Soliano, and 25th Brigade was to take San Martino. And both the attacks were launched on 4th, on the night of 4th and 5th. These objectives were secured by the evening of 5th of October, and after which these brigades, they started to get closed up on river Rubicone. So after which the 20th Brigade went on to take Monte Farneto, and the 25th Brigade was given the task of Monte Gattona, and the 3rd Brigade, the 10th Brigade, was in reserve. And at this time, the Gurkha Laurel Brigade, it also came under the command of 10th Indian Division. And going on, so there were actions at Monte Spiccato and Monte Cicco and Monte Codruzzo. And so this is the direction going towards Cesena, Forli, Faenza. And I want to mention something here regarding an action near Monte Cavallo. This is action of Royal Garhwal Rifles, and particularly Naik Tilok Singh Rawat of Royal Garhwal Rifles. So on this attack, it was 1st of October 1944. So they were pitched against the stormtroopers of the German army, and in the assault, they had finished all their ammunition. So Naik Tilok Singh Rawat, he stalked machine gun soldiers and attacked them and killed 2 of them. Took hold of the machine gun and ammunition, and took 2 prisoners of war, and came back to his section. And he was back in time when the enemy launched a counterattack. And thanks to the gun and the ammunition he brought, they repulsed additional 2 counterattacks. Finally, the company was given the orders to withdraw. But Naik Tilok Singh Rawat stayed back. He said that I will cover the withdrawal, and he made sure that everyone else was safe. And unfortunately, he was killed in this action. He was recommended for Victoria Cross, but he was eventually awarded an Indian Order of Merit. So this is one story which it's very close to my heart, actually.
Well, thanks Drew, for that. So, as I mentioned, and we've discussed, the Gothic Line battle on the Adriatic was plagued by multiple problems. A lot of it had to do with the lack of sufficient reserves, low ammunition supplies, and the weather, of course, and the morale of the troops. And so the British Army High Command decided to pause the fighting of the Gothic Line offensive on the Adriatic on the Senio River in early December, even though they were only about 60 kilometers from Bologna. And this resulted in a stalemate along the river with the German army that lasted for nearly 4 months. So, what route did the 10th Indian Division follow to get to the Senio River, and where were they during the 4-month winter face-off with German forces?
So what I have learned is like Indian troops on couple of occasions tried to establish bridgeheads across Senyo River, but then they had to like draw in because the German counterattack was very fierce. My understanding is that the route which they took was going from River Savio, River Ronco, and then eventually reaching Sanyo through Pergola and Monte Coralli.
But the most important feature they captured was Monte Grande. They were stationed there. It's in the vicinity of Imola, just to give you a little wider picture. And they held this mount. It was a key point between the two armies, the U.S. and the British Eighth. It's not high in elevation, but it was a very important point to start the following spring offensive.
Okay, Matteo, let's get back to you. So after the Monte Cavallara's battle, where did the 8th and the Argyll troops spend November before the start of the stalemate in early December on the Senio?
Okay, so the first 3 months of the autumn of 1944, September, October, November, we can say that these months were mainly on the Apennines between Tuscany and Emilia-Romagna. In October, at the beginning, they had the Battle of Monte Cavallara, and then the next day they advanced, and they mainly fought in skirmishes in that part of the valley. They also did back and forth from the Tuscany because they need to rest because the fightings on the hills was very tough. The terrain on which they were fighting was very harsh and difficult. In November, they passed from the valley of the Monte Cavallara and they tried to reach San Daniele and Carimalanca, which are closer to Faenza. And after November, in December, they were also deployed on Monte Cerere. It had been already defended by the American forces. In December, they were sent there to cover a hole in a missing part of the defensive line of the Allied forces. And on that day, unfortunately, on the few days they were deployed on Monte Cerere, the German Fallschirmjäger and other Wehrmacht soldier made a counteroffensive, and the Argyll had one of their fiercest battles of the entire war. In November, they had a lot of logistic problem. The Indian had mules with them. They couldn't use vehicles, so the American trucks or the British trucks were too large for Italian streets and the mountain pass. Also, at the end of 1944, and after some weeks of rest in Tuscany, they could reach the main front line on the Senio River on the beginning of 1945.
So one other question. So when the British 8th Army, which as I mentioned previously, also included Polish, Canadian, and New Zealand troops, finally achieved a breakthrough on the Senio River, and that was in early April. And then several weeks later, the war actually ended in Italy on May 2nd. And at that time, the Argylls and the Sunderland troops were together with the Indian soldiers of the 8th Division at the town of Costa do Rovigo by the Po River. So, can you tell us about that day when the bloody, agonizing 5 years and some 9 months of World War II in Europe finally came to an end, and one of the most unique and colorful celebrations in Italy and probably even Europe took place with the Scottish troops and the Indian troops?
So when the war stopped, ended, they were reached by this news on the Costa di Rovigo town and the city. This soldier the Argyle. Most of the Indian forces of the 8th Indian Division that were fighting with the Argyles, they had celebration in Costa di Rovigo. We can imagine the feelings of this soldier, Ray Ward and other officer, together with also NCOs, they fought on North Africa campaign. They fought in Sicily. They fought in the center of Italy, and then they get to north of Italy. After years of fighting, they were very tired, and this news was a joy, a very happy moment. And after the experience they had with the Indian, this can be considered like a moment of brotherhood in arms. They really had an incredible experience. And on that day, the pipers, the musician of the Argyle and Southern Highlanders band, together with the Indians, they played music, they danced, they created a very multi-ethnical moment. And on that day, we can also say that, quoting from the book, the spirit of comradeship and mutual admiration, which grew up between the Indian fighting man and his British counterpart in the 8th Indian Division. The name of the 8th Indian was feared and respected even amongst the German paratroopers. What is there about men like those of the 8th Indian Division, which will not be forgotten, is that the British and Indian soldiers can stand together, can fight and operate together, uphold an empire rallying the world against aggression. The Germans never believed that it was possible. They tried throughout the Italian campaign by cunning and insidious propaganda to alienate the affection of Indian soldiers for his British officer and comrade. They failed. I can end it by saying that the spectacle, also a quote from the book, the spectacle unfolded like some Durbar from the 19th century days of the Raj. The pipes and drums of the 1901st, flamboyant in kilts and badge red sporrans, wild tribal dancing from the Indians and ate some reels by the Highlanders. The firelight flickering across whirling and marching figures, faces aglow, cheered on by the incredulous Italian spectators. Also because even for the Italian, this news of the ending of the war was the beginning of a new era, let's say.
And I should point out that the camaraderie that built up and was so much on display at the end of the war between the Scottish and Indian soldiers was far different from the relationship between, for example, the African American soldiers in the U.S. Army and their superior white officers, where racism was a problem that the African American soldiers dealt with throughout their time on the Gothic Line, and is a story that we cover in another episode in the podcast. So I want to move on. Daniel, I want to follow up by asking about your more than 40 years of researching the Indian soldier story in Italy. As I mentioned in the introduction, you're considered one of the foremost experts on this subject. In fact, some people call you the Indian Division Encyclopedia. Can you tell us how you became so interested and what it means to you as an Italian to commemorate and honor the remarkable heroism of the Indian and Gurkha troops?
Encyclopedia is a bit too generous. But anyway, I got involved in this for two basic reasons. One of which is that the Fourth Indian Division fought in nearby soil here in the vicinity of where I live, and there was this act of heroism of Sir Bahadur Thapa, who was awarded the Victoria Cross. The other reason is this. Back then, some 40 years ago, there was this misconcept that Italy was liberated by the Brits, called English, and the Americans, while there are at least 30 other nationals involved. Even within the Brits, you must consider the Welsh, the Scots, and Northern Ireland. So there's this misconception that only two parties were involved in the liberation of Italy. And that this is unfair, especially for the Indian divisions and for the fact that a good 6,000 Indians lost their lives in liberating Italy, to which you must add 20,000, and when we mean wounded, the loss of a limb or whatever other functions. So I started investigating, and I really combed every single battlefield of the Indian army from southern Italy all the way up to the Po. I collected many relics, and in fact, in the Arno Valley in Subiano, we have a museum that I am vice chairing, which has collected many Indian army relics and items. And throughout these years, we have developed, my group and I, steady contacts with the Indian embassy. And as Drew can testify, Dhruv and I met with Prime Minister Modi, with the Secretary of Minister of Defense, with the embassy. We're constantly in contact. And most recently, we even recovered the remains of an Indian missing in action, whose burial occurred just a week ago in Arezzo at the attendance of a British delegation, among whom was a Colonel, Erica Bridge, who gave the honor burial. Most likely was a Gurkha or a Maratha. There was no way to identify precisely his ethnic groups. So this is the main reason why I've been focusing on this, to pay tribute to the sacrifice of the Indian soul.
So, do you feel that their achievements have received the recognition and attention that deserve in Italy now, in Europe, and the United States since you began doing the work to highlight their contribution?
Yes, indeed. In recent years, very, very much so. Initially, there was a bit of, say, slow motion because this chapter of history of the Italian campaign was virtually unknown to the wider Italian public. But throughout these years, contacting constantly mayors of the locations which the Indians were awarded the highest military awards, I managed to promote 5 Indian PC memorials, two of which were on the Senio line at San Potito di Lugo and Sabbioni di Lugo. One in San Marino, one in the Tiber Valley, and most recently, one in the 8th Division sector overlooking Modigliana. This was unveiled in April at the attendance of the Vice Ambassador Indian Ambassador in Rome. So I would say there's great recognition, even with the work of Matteo and Drew. They're doing excellent job in promoting the memory of the Indian soldiers and the Gurkhas. Actually, Drew and I are trying to promote in the territory of Rimini a World War II Indian memorial commemorating all the Indian soldiers who sacrificed their lives in the Italian campaign, an analogy of a World War I Indian memorial located in France commemorating all the Indian losses in France and in the Flanders. In that scenario, that theater, the Indians lost 5,000 men. So Dhruv and I have been contacting both the embassy in Rome, the mayor of Rimini, because we would like to have this monument erected and unveiled in Rimini. So we're looking forward to this. It's possible, and the project would be sponsored and paid by the Indian government and the Indian Army.
Okay. I wanted to turn now to the final part of the discussion. So, an important component of the podcast is a past is present theme, and that primarily relates to the fact that currently the largest war since World War II is raging on the European continent due to Russia's brutal attack on Ukraine, which began nearly 4 years ago. Moreover, many historians insist a replay of the 1930s that led up to the start of World War II is currently ongoing. At the same time, the Russians are also carrying out a hybrid war against European countries with assassinations, cyber attacks, airport disruptions with drones, infrastructure disruptions at sea, on land, and of course, an online political disinformation campaign. And earlier this year, 84-year-old Italian President Sergio Mattarella stated unequivocally that what Russian President Vladimir Putin is doing in Ukraine is no different to what Hitler did in Europe and Italy in World War II. And despite this obvious brutal assault in Ukraine, here in Italy, the overwhelming majority of politicians and the public are opposed to providing military arms to help the Ukrainians. And they are also opposed to contributing soldiers to the European coalition of the willing peacekeeping force that is being set up to hopefully enforce a possible peace ceasefire or agreement in Ukraine. And this lack of Italian solidarity with Ukraine strikes many especially in some parts of Northern Europe and elsewhere, as disconcerting, if not hypocritical, especially considering how so many foreign soldiers sacrificed their lives in Italy in World War II to rescue it from the Nazis and Italian fascists, such as we've discussed today. And clearly, one of the goals of Mattarella's speech was to address this worrying lack of solidarity with Ukraine. So I would like to ask each of you to comment on this situation. And so, Daniel, let's start with you. There's an old saying that if you do not know history, you're bound to repeat it. So, is the lack of Italian and public and political support for Ukraine due to the lack of knowledge amongst much of the public about what happened in Italy 80 years ago?
Wow. This is a bit of a thorny issue. Let's say the comparisons with the past. The current situation in Eastern Europe is not similar to that at the time of Hitler. Hitler had the goal of conquering the entire world, and he nearly made it. And thanks to the rest of the world forming a coalition to defeat him, that had been successful. In the context of the Ukraine situation, I think it's rather different. If we want to look back to history, we should do it to what occurred in recent times. So I would say this: the NATO group and Western European forces are far superior to that of the Russians because the warfare is different now. You need hyper technology, not only air superiority, but electronics. Electronics are the main weapons today. And I believe the Western coalition can overcome the Russians in that theater in a short period of time. Point is, in this kind of war today, nuclear weapons are available on both sides. It's nothing compared to 80 years ago. Even trying to remove Putin would be a great problem. He's a dictator, no doubt about it. He, he started this war 4 years ago. It's practically a stalemate because he can't go any further. And this goes to show that Ukraine is facing rather bravely facing the Russian troops, and throwing in allied forces would overcome the Russian invasion of the territory. But if you corner Putin, he already threatened the West of using atomic warheads, and he actually has 5,000 of them. So does the Western world, even more. The US has an equivalent number. The UK has atomic weapons, France, and so on. This is really risky business because the overthrow of Putin, the attempt to overthrow him, would put him in a corner, and he can have these last resorts to rely upon.
Dhruv, I'd like to turn to you now. As a native of India, but a resident of Italy, when you look at what's happening in Ukraine, you feel that there is a lack of urgency in Italy or even in India about the threat of the Russian attack on Ukraine and what it portends for the future, especially as Putin has made it clear his goal is to rebuild the Iron Curtain.
So, like, I see war as the main problem. Okay. And what I really don't like is that there's a war in Europe and it has become everyone's problem, whereas there are conflicts going on in Africa and we don't talk about it. We don't care about it. Now that is my concern at the same time. Like if I say something about Ukraine, I should also say something about what's happening in other parts of the world. And my analysis of the war in Ukraine is it is benefiting a lot of people. Just look at the share prices of these major defense industries. They have increased exponentially. I'm talking about companies here in Europe who are earned billions from this war. Similarly, there are companies in China probably who are gaining out of the war. And these are people who will never like this war to end. But since it is at our doorstep in Italy, we talk about it. But same thing happening in Africa, we don't discuss about it. So the problem is war, but the solution is not being implemented because there are people benefiting out of it.
Yes, well, I think it's definitely a case now where there's one person who is benefiting the most from this, and it's not the Europeans. But in any case, Matteo, let's have your thoughts on this. You have an academic background in history, and I know from some of our conversations, you have a comprehensive knowledge of not only the World War II story in Italy and Europe, but also what happened on the European continent over the last several centuries. So, can you tell me, do you and others of your generation in the Argyll Romagna group fear that what happened in Italy and Europe 80 years ago could unfold again in the coming decade?
I'll start by saying that it is true that history repeats itself if it's not studied or considered or celebrated. But it's also correct to say that it doesn't repeat the same way. But people tend to react the same way as it did years ago. We, of course, have fear that the world could collapse in another deeper situation of tensions and war. Maybe not the outbreak of a third world war, I hope really not, but at least what they call the collateral war, like the Korea War after the Second World War. So real war with a high intensity, but not on a global scale. We have this fear. I have this fear in some way, but I can also say that there won't be another Adolf Hitler, another Benito Mussolini, but there will be another, for example, Vladimir Putin, which is not like a dictator in the past. It is a modern dictator. Okay, so for example, on the military side, yes, the Western countries are more developed than Russia, but we also found out that we have smaller and very technological armies, and the line of construction of military equipment, shells, ammunition, guns is divided, and it's very difficult to create a singular line of production for all Europe, like it was did during the Second World War by the British or by the United States. Russia have a military power, pretty much dated military power, but as Daniel said, they had nuclear powers, and that is a problem. What I try also always to say is that now we have to find, because of the context we are living, a solution, political, or I could say also military, because we don't know what our leaders will try to do in the next years.
Okay, well, thank you, Matteo. I just want to say, I don't think anybody is interested to displace Putin. All they're trying to do is to stop him from bombing women, men, kidnapping children in Ukraine, and basically let them live as a sovereign nation like all other countries would like. But in any case, with those thoughts from all of you, I will bring this discussion to a close. And I would like to thank all three of you for participating and providing such informative commentary. And I also would like to remind listeners to stay tuned for the second part of this series on the Indian Army divisions that fought on the Gothic Line. And in this second episode, we will take a field trip to an 80th anniversary ceremony held this summer at the Indian Soldier Cemetery in Forlì. And we will also hear the story about the dramatic life-size bronze statue at the Indian Cemetery that was designed and funded by the Sikh community in Italy. And we will also have a discussion with an Indian Army Lieutenant General who visited the Indian Army memorials this summer. And finally, we will have a discussion with the director of the Alcide Cervia Institute in Romagna, which is both a museum and a historical study center. The institute was set up in honor of a family whose parents lost 7 sons killed by an Italian fascist firing squad on December 28, 1943. Director will explain how the contribution of the Indian troops is a historical landmark and also should be a reference point in the current immigration debate in Europe that has become unfortunately manipulated by far right populist politicians. So, with that thought, I will say again, thanks, guys, for your contributions, and I look forward to perhaps future podcast episodes where we can have further discussions about these issues. Thanks again.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you so much.